got home from work. It's 3 a.m. I'm sitting there. And I'm like, starting to do and I'm looking at this. I'm like, God, can I have another week on this one? But, we don't really have that option. So it's going to be fun today. It'll be interesting. So we are making our way through the book of 1 Peter, and this has been an adventure. We are savoring this book. My wife, she's like, you need to stop talking about how long it's taken us to get through it. I'm like, well, we're taking forever, like chapter 3, it took us like 7 or 8 weeks and I'm not supposed to bring that up.
I know.
I just did. Sorry. But rather than, we're going through it so slow, we're savoring this. We're not just gulping it down. If you go to fast food, you can gulp that down, you're not missing much. Right? It's salt and it's fat and it's delicious. And, you just gulp that down. You go to a nice restaurant, sometimes you want to slow down. You catch little nuances. It's like we were just up at Seven Sisters and I ordered the fish and chips, which sounds pretty pedestrian. But I'm sitting there, I'm eating this, and they got like some kind of slaw on the bottom with some kind of dressing. I'm like, there's a flavor going on there I can't identify, and it's good. So you get to a place like that, you just got to slow down and take your time and eat little bites and eat it very slowly. That's what we're doing with this book, because there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of really good things, and we're just slowing down and we're just kind of taking our time with it. We're savoring it. So last week, where we left off, we actually finished chapter 3, and Peter says, who will harm you if you are eager or zealous to do good? And it's not saying that it's not going to happen, but he's actually inviting us to consider the type of people that would harm us when we're trying to do good. He's actually making us consider that, to try and see them as people and see why they would do that. He says, if you're going to suffer, be blessed for suffering for doing what is right. There are natural consequences, we mentioned, when you break the law, when you do the bad things. And, if you do bad, natural consequences come your way. He says, if you're going to suffer for doing good. Man, that's the way to do it. Instead of being fearful in the face of suffering and persecution, he says, keep Jesus in the center of everything as Lord. And we mentioned that we struggle sometimes with the number of lords on the throne of our lives. There's room for one. There should only be one. There can be only one. We quote a lot of movies here, don't we? Sorry about that. Just came popping right out. There can be only one. We need to keep Jesus front and center in our lives. And if anything else starts creeping up on that throne, we need to take that off and get rid of it and move it off to its rightful place. Peter said that Jesus died once and for all to give us access to God. And we talked about how that's like park hopper tickets at Disneyland. If you get park hopper tickets, they're expensive. And you don't just go sit at the bus stop on Harbor Boulevard and turn around. It's like, I can see Disneyland from here. I'm good. You want to go in. You've seen it. You've been technically to it, but you want to go in and enjoy the full benefit of having access to the entire, both parks. And we should do the same thing. Jesus died once for all to give us access, to give us these beautiful tickets to where God is at. We shouldn't just kind of sit on the outskirts and, I've seen him, I know where he's at, I'm good. We need to go on in. Peter, after discussing our relationships to each other as families, churches, and citizens of where we live, is bringing it all back to Jesus now. And Peter does that. He always did that. When Peter didn't understand Jesus fully, Peter would bring things back to Jesus. And he's doing that right now. He's bringing it all back to Jesus. And we need to do that same thing. We get kind of mired up in, politics and pet church doctrines and stuff. And sometimes those are the things that will creep up on the throne of our hearts. And we need to get those off and put Jesus back where he belongs. We need to keep Jesus front and center in our hearts. So we start a brand new chapter today. 1 Peter chapter 4, if you're following along with us. Starting in verse 1, it says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. So he's bringing it back around. He started with Jesus in the very beginning of this book, and then he started talking about hardships and our relationships to each other when things get hard. He talked about wives and husbands. He talked about us in our communities, in our countries, in our governmental authorities, us in our church communities. And now, he's bringing it back around where he started, that Jesus thing. Therefore, and when you see therefore, you got to ask what it's there for, right? Because we are saved through resurrection and Jesus has again taken his rightful place in authority, is where we left off last time. Therefore, since Christ suffered, arm yourselves with the same attitude. That's an interesting phrasing. Arm yourselves with that same attitude. He may be referring, like making a reference to the zealots again. Last time, it's like, who's going to harm you if you're eager, if you're zealous to do good? And that might have been directed. There was this political party back in the day, the zealots, that wanted to get rid of Rome. Everybody wanted to get rid of Rome. But the zealots were ready to take up arms and go to it. Go to war, kick Rome out of Jerusalem, get Rome away from their temple city, and get back to doing things the way they used to do without having this go-between of the Roman government. And the zealots wanted to do that. She said, he talked about being zealous to do good. Being zealous is not a bad thing, but don't be zealous to go to war and kill people and break things and hurt people. Be zealous to do good. And I think he might be bringing that back again. Since Christ suffered, arm yourselves with the same attitude. He's like, man, go into that gun safe and open it up and arm yourselves, but not with what you would normally arm yourself when you think of arming yourself. And it means just what it says. To arm yourself, not with a sword, not with a gun, not with a hand grenade, not even to arm yourself with cynicism and sarcasm. I'm really good at arming myself with that sometimes, huh? Yeah. She says, yeah, you are. Not to arm ourselves with those things, but to arm ourselves with the attitude of Jesus as he suffered, which is the attitude being thinking, consideration, meditation, and understanding. What was the attitude of Jesus as he suffered? Right? He could have armed himself with all kinds of stuff. You know, he could have looked around, he's like, you see all this stuff? Yeah, this is here because of me. And I'm going to, I could call down, I could smite you right now. I could. And he didn't do that. He didn't arm himself that way. His attitude was that he was there for a reason. He knew why he was there. He knew that the suffering was going to bring about great benefit. If not in that very moment, that, as soon as he died, that's what blew the doors of heaven open, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles, for everybody, for the whole world to come and have access to God. He knew that there was benefit there. That was his attitude. He was digging in for better or for worse. When we suffer, we should also dig in for better or for worse. And when I was thinking of that, for better or for worse, that makes me think of marriage vows. You ever really stop and think about those? Usually you're so nervous when you say them if you're up there, and they really mean something. The marriage vows, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, means these things are going to happen. You'll have times of richer, you'll have times of poorer, you'll have times of better, you'll have times of worse, you'll have times of health, you'll have times of sickness. And just saying, I'm digging in for better, for worse. I am staying here. I am with you through the good times and the bad times. And that's kind of what Peter's calling us to do in our marriage. As we're the bride of Christ, and we talked before about what a strange imagery that is, but we are. And as we should make that vow to Jesus that we're in for the long haul. This is long game, that we're here for better, for worse. Understanding that we'll have some good times and suffering will come. It will. And when it does, we need to dig in and have that long game mentality. So living with that understanding and consideration that Jesus had when he was on the cross. Get your head in the game. Be intentional, knowing that it's for something bigger than you and that it will be worth it. And when suffering comes our way, that's the attitude we need to take. God is doing something. Might not see what it is now, might not ever get to see what it is, but he's doing something. He's got a reason. He's going to take this shattered, awful situation, and he's going to bring some good out of that somehow. And then Peter says, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. Done. I'm done with sin. Wish it was that easy. D. Edmund Hebert, who was an emeritus at the Mennonite College in Fresno, went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, left us at an old age in 95. But he said about this, he says, this depicts the spiritual state of the victorious sufferer. It carries a note of triumph. He has effectively broken off with a life dominated by sin. It need not mean that he no longer commits any act of sin, but that his old life, dominated by the power of sin, has been terminated. So it's like we're not in that lifestyle anymore. That's not our way of life. Well, we'll still trip up and fall and miss the mark and, get angry and rebel from time to time, but that is not our lifestyle anymore. In times of suffering, when we are most uncomfortable, now, I would pray that nobody has to suffer today. I don't want anybody to suffer. I don't like my friends to suffer. I don't like my family. I don't like to see people suffer. I hate seeing people suffer. But that comes our way. And when it does, there is opportunity in the face of this suffering. When we are most uncomfortable, our core values show the most. And if it's not the core values, it's the fact that we need to find us some core values that shows the most. Everything else gets burned up or pushed back off the front burner for at least a time. In times of grief, the important things remain. When you can grieve all kinds of things. Man, sometimes we lose people, and it hurts. And it's one of the most awful things we have to go through. We can have change in our lives. We can lose a job, a career. Things happen, and we can grieve that. When these hard times happen, when you grieve the loss of something or someone that you love, that you like, when you face financial ruin, when you are exploited and done wrong or mistreated for doing right, and it's going to happen from time to time. It doesn't matter at that time, when you're in your grief, when you're at your lowest, it doesn't matter what you drive. You don't care what you drive. You don't care if you have the right clothes. You don't care what your neighbors think of you. All that stuff gets kind of burned up. It gets pushed away. It gets pushed off the front burner. And what is there is our core values. The important things remain. And Paul said, these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And I think in times of suffering, all that fluff is sifted out and blown away. And faith, hope, and love remain. You don't care, if you're going to get the promotion. You don't care at that point when you're suffering who wins the election. All that stuff fades away into the background, and you're left with the important things. Do the people I love know that I love them? And these are the important things that remain. Have I served God well? Am I doing something that matters with my life? And that's why it says in Ecclesiastes, it's better to go to a funeral than a house of feasting, because we are reminded of these things. Whenever I get to do a funeral, we're all going to have our turn. Being in the box at the front of the room, every single one of us is going to have our turn. And it's those points that we are, we're sitting there, we're grieving, we hurt, we're missing a person, there's a hole in our lives, and we know that that's coming for us too, eventually. And, so all the fluff burns away, all the important things remain. What am I doing with my right now? A lot of times sin causes suffering. Have you ever experienced that? Here come the consequences of my own actions. A lot of times sin causes suffering. And our response should be to push that stuff away. Whoever suffers and is done with sin doesn't go on living for evil, but desires to do the will of God. Verse 3. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. There's a list for you. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. He says, you spend enough time doing what others do. This is a reference to how the well-to-do lived back in that day. Now, this list and what it describes is kind of references the Greco-Roman feast. This is something that that the well-to-do people got to take part in, and they would go and they would have these like crazy parties. You know, they had the money, they had the time, they had the resources, and they would party like rock stars. And this shows us, one of the neat things that shows us is that it's not just the Jews now at this point that this letter is being received by. There are like Gentile people, there are well-to-do Gentile people that have come out of a pretty hardcore party lifestyle that are coming in and they're hearing this. And I don't know why Peter, you know, he might have had like a single person in mind. He might have had a group of people that needed to hear this, but he said it, and there it is. So there were these people that walked away from the party. They walked into Jesus, and they walked into this church community. They walked away from the party, and that's what it describes. Debauchery. The King James says lewdness. Lewdness. That makes me feel self-righteous when I say it. Lewdness. Debauchery. Out of control, excessive and outrageous sensuality with zero moral restraint, especially in regard to sexuality and violence. Lust. A craving for something you shouldn't have. Right? This is not good for me, but I want it. That's lust. Drunkenness comes from a Greek word that means drunk. There's your deep one for the day. Orgies and carousing kind of come from the same word komos, the Greek word. And the Strong's Concordance, I love what it says about this. A nocturnal and riotous procession of half-drunken and frolicsome fellows who after supper parade through the streets with torches and music in honor of Bacchus or some other deity, and sing and play before houses of male and female friends. Hence use generally of feasts and drinking parties that are protracted till late at night and indulge in revelry. Oh, how poetic that is. Don't be one of those fellows that go out riotously marauding through the streets. So there's a sense here that it's taking the party to the streets in the wee hours. That you start the party, and the party goes, and the party escalates, and now you're taking the party to the streets, and, you know, running through and singing, and you know those guys.
Sounds like Mardi Gras.
Yeah, it sounds like Mardi Gras. I had a couple of those people in the showroom at the casino last night that were, yeah, I'm pretty sure they went out and caroused in the streets afterward. So taking the party to the streets in the wee hours. And so the Greco-Roman banquets that he's referring to, they would pour the drinks in honor to Roman gods, these pagan Roman gods. They would pour, they would drink, they would party well into the night, and then they would go carousing, they would chase down slave girls, they would chase down slave boys for their own pleasure. So there's a sense of exploitation of the helpless to feed their own lust as well. This is not good. And as I look at this, I'm like, man, that's pretty terrible. You know, I'm sure the Jewish people that were reading this letter is like, who's doing that? Well, we're not doing that. Who's doing that? It must be those Gentile people that came in, you know, carousing in the streets and all this stuff. How much has not changed in 2,000 years? Right? I'm looking at this, I'm thinking Jeffrey Epstein. You know, there are people out there who just want to, they've got the money, they got the resources, they're going to party, they're going to use other people, they're just going to do their thing and feed their lusts. You know, not to pick on him, I understand Ravi Zacharias had some problems too. They're coming out now. You know, that raises its head in the church as well. Don't think that because you're in the church that you're immune to being victimized by this, to partaking in this kind of activity. It'll sneak up on you and it'll get you. And then verse 4. They are surprised that you do not join them in the reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Doesn't that sound like peer pressure? It's like, oh, come on. You know you want to come party. You want to drink to Bacchus and go sing in the street. Come on. What's the matter with you, loser? Last week, Peter asked who would harm you for being zealous to do good. And it's people like this. We pointed out last time that if you're living in light, if you're like really endeavoring to live your life in light, that sometimes that steps on someone else's darkness. And people like their darkness sometimes. And when your light steps on someone's darkness, that kind of makes them mad. And they might do wrong because you're trying to do good. Who are those who are now dead that he's talking about? You know, Peter had that that kind of cryptic statement last time about how Jesus went and preached to the people, from Noah's day, and we're figured out we don't really have an answer for that. I want to ask him someday, what are you talking about? And I think this kind of goes with that. Rather than get hung up on that, just know that there was concern in the early church about the afterlife. There wasn't a lot of really clear teaching. Jesus had made mention of it, but it's like as time goes on and they were expecting the return of Jesus, they were hoping that nobody would have to die, right? Because Jesus is coming soon. Jesus has been coming soon for 2,000 years. Jesus is still coming soon. All right, we're going to talk about that next week. But they were hoping that nobody would have to die, and then people started to die. It's like, well, what happens to these people? They died before Jesus came back. Are they okay? Are they in? Or, what happens? And there was some concern about that in the early church, about life after death, and those who had already gone on. But what Peter is saying, rather than get mired up into who the now dead people are, he's saying, let people judge you here and now by human standards, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. That's the main point. That's what he's getting at. Living not for God and chasing empty goals is such a waste of precious time. There is so much competing for our time, so much competing for our lordship of our lives, and living not for God is an incredible waste of our time and our resources. What this all made me think of, and here comes another movie reference. Well, actually, it was a book. The book was better. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. You guys remember that? Anybody read that? Gollum. I love, and I'm pretty sure Tolkien did it intentionally, that here you have, when he was Smeagol, he was cool. He was this happy little guy, and then he finds his precious. He finds his thing. He finds this thing that he's not supposed to have. He's not supposed to keep on him. And he gets so consumed with his precious that now he's not in the light. He's living in a cave, and he's becoming something totally different because he won't give up this thing that's killing him. And our sin is like that, right? Richard Rohr, I agree with him on this, says that all sin is rooted in some kind of addiction, right? Where we get in and we just can't. We start, and once we go down that road, it gets really hard to put the precious down, to let the precious go, and you will protect your precious at any cost. Makes me think of that. And Gollum, the whole time he was down there, what's he doing? He's not doing anything. He's sitting down there, he's all consumed with his precious. He's all consumed with this thing that he's addicted to. And in the meantime, all his relationships have fallen by the wayside. Everybody that used to know him and love him, he doesn't interact with them anymore, and he's living in the dark, away from everybody, with solitude, just him and his addiction. And that's all he's got. I love that imagery. What a waste of time for poor little Smeagol, poor little Gollum. And we can fall into that same thing. As we read through all this debauchery and drunkenness, it kind of reminded me of college. But you should grow out of that. It's a waste of time. Every minute you're hungover and not, and sleeping in till 3 in the afternoon, you're not studying. And that's probably why you should actually be at college. Passed out and drunk people don't love. When they're passed out and drunk, they don't serve. They don't do anything that we are called to back in chapter 3. And I'm just going to point you back to chapter 3, where it says that we are to try and get along with people. We are to submit to the government as far as we can. We are in our relationships, husbands and wives and families, we're to mutually lift and serve each other, to keep each other propped up. In our church communities, love has to prevail. Love has to be the big thing as we rally around each other and keep each other mutually lifted. You can't do that when you're passed out and drunk, and when you're chasing stuff you shouldn't be chasing, when you're wasting your time chasing things that are empty, they're going to have nothing to give you. When you're chasing hard after the things with no worth, it's a waste of precious time. We're called to live the rest of our days for God. And, people who are going to do the party thing, that's fine. Let them judge us, and, they're going to be accountable for what they do. Let them judge us by their standards, whatever. That doesn't matter. We are called to live for God. That's what we're called to do. And we're going to look a little more next week also, remind ourselves exactly what that is. It's not the checklist of rules. Right? It's like I kept this commandment and this commandment and this commandment. And, there's a lot more to it than that. So, if we are suffering, if we have suffered, and I know pretty much everybody here has probably been in that camp. Everybody has lost. Everybody has suffered. The beautiful thing about that, the opportunity, is that all that stuff is stripped away. And that Confessions of a Funeral Director book, he says that the veil between eternity and earth, the veil between the holy and the here, is the thinnest in our times of grief. And I don't want to go through grief. I hate, going through that pain and walking through that process. But oh man, the opportunity that comes when you look back and, as you get your own life in order, you straighten things out, you find out what's really important, and then somebody else comes along who's going through a similar kind of grief, and it's like, I feel for you. I've been there. I've walked that path. Let me help you. Let me rally around you. Let's mutually lift each other, because that's what we're called to do. If we're suffering and we have suffered, let's consider what our response is to it. Are we arming ourselves? And sometimes in grief, grief will bring out the best and the worst in people. People will start fighting over dumb things. It's like, no, I want the ugly plate that used to be hanging on the wall of grandma's house. People will fight over dumb things. And rather than arming ourselves with our wants and our needs and our, trying to deal and getting angry and, doing the best we can, trying to handle these emotions and sending them out in bad ways, let's arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ in our suffering. So just think about that as we go through the rest of this week. How are we living the rest of our earthly lives? Verse 2, I don't know if you saw that, but he made mention of how we're, living the rest of our earthly lives, the rest of our lives here. Let's examine ourselves on that. Let's be intentional about that this week. So just be thinking about that. These are the thoughts you can just let rattle around your heart, your mind, your soul as you go this week. Arm yourself with the attitude of Christ and examine how you're living your life, and if you're chasing after too many things, if you got too many lords, if you got precious and you're hiding out in the dark, it might be time to make some changes. Put that stuff down, put Jesus back on the throne, get back out in the light, and live for God. So we'll talk more about that next week. Come back next week if you can. If you can't, we'll have it online by Monday or Tuesday next week. And this is kind of like part one. This is half of what I actually wanted to get to today. So today we talk about suffering and debauchery. Yay! But I think there was good in that, wasn't there? I know it was good for me. So let's pray. We'll do one more song. And Lord, we thank you again for your word. We thank you that even when we have to bite off a chunk that isn't complete and it looks kind of weird at the get-go, there's so much going on there that you can teach us. And Lord, I pray that your Holy Spirit walks the halls of our hearts and minds, that you would show us what needs to change. As we consider how we're living the rest of our lives now, Lord, if we need to do things differently, help us to be intentional and do those things differently. Help us if we are in a place of suffering now, or if suffering comes our way, when suffering comes our way, help us to be broken open and not broken apart. Help us to stick in, to be just intentional about that, to arm ourselves with the attitude of Christ, knowing that the great good can come out of great hurt. And Lord, just remind us of that. Help us to just have that long game mentality. And we thank you for every person that is here today. And we thank you for being here. Pray that you would go with us the rest of the day, no matter what we're going to do. If we're headed home, going to be on the road, going out to play, that you would just be with us in our hearts, our minds, the forefront of our thoughts, on the throne of our lives as we go today. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.